The tragic fate of the once proud nation state of Syria is an object lesson for all multi-ethnic third world countries. It is a lesson they must heed and prepare for and ensure that they don't fall into this kind of a trap, destructive trap. The simple fact is that the nation state of Syria has been carved like a turkey into multifarious segments. The northern area adjacent to Turkey has been for some time under the control of the Syrian Free Army, a grouping that was kept in power by Turkey to try and topple the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now it is also the home ground of the HTS, the Tehreek al-Shams, you see, led by the Jolani, that character Jolani, who was once a member of the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS, the Islamic State, the most rabid Salafi jihadi organization in the world. Through this HTS, the Turks have now captured their once old vilayat of Aleppo, which was once part of Turkish territory. Turkey had ruled all over the whole of Syria once before it became a free nation state. Now the HTS went on from Idlis to capture the city of Aleppo. It went on to the city of Homs and Hamas, and now it has ensconced itself in Damascus, the capital. It all happened in a matter of 10 days. The entire Syrian army collapsed like a house of cards. How? Why? Because the Americans, through the Kurds, had captured the entire area. So how did the collapse in Syria happen so suddenly and so swiftly, so dramatically? The simple fact is that the Americans, via the Kurdish insurgents, had captured the entire oil producing area of Syria. This was to deny the Syrians the entire oil revenues. Then they imposed very harsh sanctions on the Syrian regimes, which reduced the people and the country of Syria to abject poverty and impoverishment. Because of this, the Syrian army was weakened, the Syrian nation state was weakened, reduced to dire straits. The Syrian army was in such a bad strait that the Syrian commanders were taking bribes from their men not to come on to their trenches and morchas, but to stay at home and be shown as present. Quite obviously, a collapse was obvious. The American CIA, the Israeli Mossad, then simply bribed the Syrian army commanders, the corps commanders, the divisional commanders, all the top level leadership of the Syrian army was simply bribed off like they had done in 2003 in Iraq with the Republican Guards, the elite Republican Guards who had formed a ring around Baghdad to defend their country, put up a last-ditch stand. We all thought that the Republican Guards were combat hardened and they would put up a damn good fight because, they had seen many battles. It was not a ceremonial outfit. But the Republican Guards just melted away without a fight. The world was shocked as to what happened. It was only later that the Americans revealed that they had paid huge bribes to the Iraqi army, their generals, their brigadiers, to simply walk off from the battlefield, commit treachery for their country, and on the promise that when the new regime came, when the Americans took charge in Baghdad, they would rehabilitate them and give them plum plush appointments. They got a kick. They got nothing of that sort. They were taken for a total ride. And they were very bitter about it. And it is the Republican Guards, their officers, soldiers who were out of job on the streets, who later formed the Islamic State. and they created mayhem in Iraq, and then they got into Raqqa in Syria, and the rest of course is history. Precisely the same tactic, bribe tactic, was repeated in Syria. The impoverished Syrian army on the brink of more or less starvation was simply paid up to vanish from the scene. And in 10 days, the HTS, now tried to tell us that it was the greatest military force in the world. Nobody could stand up to it, that the enemies would melt. Yes, if your enemies are bribed, they will melt away. The Syrian army committed unspeakable treachery against its own nation state. And the nation state today has ceased to exist. The Syrian Free Army holds the northern belt. The HTS holds the entire belt from Idlib to Aleppo to Damascus. The Kurds hold the entire eastern portion where the oil fields are, and they are strictly under the control of the Americans, so all the oil revenues go to the American companies and not to the people of Syria, to which it belongs. The southern side, there are a whole host of insurgent outfits who had been fighting against Bashar al-Assad. They were the remnants of the Iraqi Shia groups, and also there was the Hezbollah which was operating there, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards which had actually retaken Aleppo. And sometimes around 2016, 17, 18, 19, in that phase, they had done some very hard fighting to support Bashar al-Assad. And the Russians, of course, as we all know, from 2015 they had started their intervention to shore up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which was a secular government which gave all rights to its women and to its various sectarian minorities. It was one of the few secular governments in the Middle East which has now been destroyed. And we have had the IS, Islamic State, imposed upon Syria. And now the Western press, the CNN, held an interview of Jolani to try and hail him as the most democratic leader who had liberated his country and is now going to lead it to a democratic paradise with free enterprise, etc., etc., all thrown into the bargain. It was hilarious. This is a man who is with the Al-Nusra. Before that, he was directly part of the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. He had committed unspeakable atrocities against the people of Syria, in that particular phase. Then he became the Al-Nusra. From the Al-Nusra, he is transformed into the HTS, and now we are being told and there were $10 million bounty on the heads of this Jolani. Now we are told he is the most democratic example of good democratic leadership which the rest of the world must emulate, in the third world especially. We must emulate this kind of bloodthirsty tyrants, who are there, who have brought liberation to Syria. What a bloody liberation. His men are now busy shooting up their enemies on the streets of Aleppo and Damascus and Homs. They are shooting up their enemies, they are torturing them to death. They have taken away all the rights of the minorities. They have taken away the rights of the women. We have a new Taliban in power in Damascus. And this is the IS, so it is worse than the Taliban. And it has been brought in by the Americans, the Israelis, the Turks, and being hailed as to the rest of the world as liberation. The Turks want to use the HTS to destroy the Kurds. They hate the Kurds hate them, pay back that compliment absolutely. The Israelis, meantime, the Israeli army has attacked across the Jolan Heights, the same heights for which they had fought so bitterly with the Syrian army in 1967 and then in 1973. There was such a monumental seesaw struggle between the Israeli and the Syrian armies that at one stage Golda Meir was thinking of using the nuclear weapon to stop the Syrians. That was the stage. The Syrian army had fought so well at that stage. Today, the same Jolan Heights, not a shot has been fired, not a whimper. Israel has taken over the Jolan Heights. The strategic Jolan Heights, which were once the invasion route between Israel and Damascus and Tel Aviv. Now the Israelis have also been bombing 300 sorties a day more or less for the last 3-4 days. They have bombed whatever stocks, weapons and equipment of the Syrian Army, Navy and Air Force that they can locate. So they have destroyed the very basis of the structure of the armed forces of Syria, so that that nation state is now sans any armed forces apart from these cartoon networks of the HTS, the Shams and this and that, alphabet soup that we have. The nation state has been destroyed. And Jolani gave a press conference and shamelessly he said, I have no time to right now defend the sovereignty of Syria against the Israeli attacks. I am very busy trying to get water and electricity to my people. So very sarcastically he was asked, we know it's not your priority to fight the Israelis, but what are you going to do about defending Syrian sovereignty? And he had very little, his rep had very little to say. I mean, how shameless can you get? You destroy your own country because of the bribes that you have been given. Bribes by intelligence agencies of the United States and Israel, of Turkey and what have you, from wherever you could grab money, you've taken money to sell your state down the tube. And today you claim to be liberators. Today these people claim to be people who have rescued their country from the tyranny of Bashar al-Assad. And in return, the people now have the absolute tyranny of the IS, which has wasted not a minute in declaring that Syria is now an Islamic state. The law of Sharia will now be enforced, and already some women have been stoned to death in Aleppo. Stoned to death. It's back to the Stone Ages, to a country which was relatively quite liberal, modernistic and secular under Bashar al-Assad. Now women are being stoned to death. They are being forced to cover up from head to foot. They have lost all their rights to education, free speech, jobs, everything, etc. It's another Taliban let loose on the once secular, very modernistic, relatively liberal state of Syria. It's all gone to pieces. A nation state has been destroyed. The Turks are very keen to somehow push back 3 million Syrian refugees that had flown into Turkey because of the civil war, which the Turks themselves had helped to ignite. So they want these Syrian refugees back. Out of the 5 million that had gone to Turkey, 2 million had gone on to Europe. Europe is very keen to get rid of these Syrian refugees. Europe is very keen to get rid of these 2 million refugees and send them packing right back to Syria. So will they come back to Syria and find a country? Will they find peace and quiet? Will they find time to educate their children, send them to schools? Their girls definitely will not go back to schools. And all those poor people who have been now, exposed to the free life in Europe, a relatively liberal way of life in Europe, I don't know how they will adjust under the IS, but I suppose they will have extremely little choice unless they want their little girls stoned to death, like has already started. We have liberated a country, you see, liberated a country so that the women can be stoned back to the Stone Age, so that they can be pushed out of all schools and colleges. They would be covered in a 6-foot tent, walking tent. That is liberation. That is the new form of liberation espoused by the greatest, strongest democracy in the world. They are giving primacy to their own geopolitical interest. It was the American agenda, suggested by the Israeli intelligence to destroy, 7 Muslim countries. So Iraq was one that was done way back in 2003, then Libya, then Somalia, then Syria was one, and the last that they have in the list is Iran. Iran. Now they've set their sights on Iran. Even Donald Trump will not likely to spare Iran. And how that will end, nobody knows, because I'm not very sure if Iran will go down the way of Syria, or will it fight and use its arsenal? Will it try in its desperation to get a nuclear weapon? All these are wild card scenarios right now, and we hope that these wild cards don't come to pass. Syria was a multi-ethnic state, multi-sectarian state. It had the Alawites, the Druze, and Christian minorities, which were fairly happy. Their state of happiness now remains to be seen. They are in the tender mercies of the Islamic State. $10 million bounty on Jolani, the head of the HTS, former Al-Nusra, former Al-Qaeda, former IS, Islamic State cadres, now being lionized as an example of a free state, a liberated state for the third world. Thank you. I don't think we need such examples and precedents in our country, in the other third world countries of the world. What we have seen is the destruction, the tragic destruction of a once proud nation state. Whether that nation state will see peace now, I reckon that it is impossible. The Kurds will fight the Turks. The Turks would like to press the HTS forward. The Israelis after a time may find the HTS a pain in the neck. Right now he is cooing like a dove. Right now he is endorsing the invasion of his own country by Israel. Tomorrow, once he is well settled, well ensconced, the way these organizations do a turnaround is not funny. And they may just, do a flip-flop and start supporting the Hamas in Gaza. The Hamas are Sunni Muslims. So he now claims to be absolutely anti-Iran and anti the Shah, anti the Shiites. But will that hold when it comes to the compatriots from Gaza, the Hamas, who were the cause of all this trouble, who started it all? So where will it end? I'm not very sure if Israel would be too happy with the HTS in power in Damascus for long. So who will take their place? And this fighting, as I see it, is going to continue. Will the refugees be allowed to come back? Well, they may, but they may be running out once again. There is no state anymore. They have destroyed the infrastructure of a state. In the Westphalian scheme of things, a nation state, had the monopoly of power, military power in its own territory. I don't think there will be any monopoly of military power. I don't think there will be any standing armed forces for quite some time to come. There will be a whole set of warring militia that will forever be at one another's throats. The Russians had supported. They had come into Syria in 2015, 2016 to shore up Bashar al-Assad, and they kept him going all this while. Now they are bogged down heavily in Ukraine. They have their own battle to fight. They can't spare much wherewithal. In fact, they had moved out most of their military wherewithal from Syria back to the main battle in Ukraine. They'd like to win that battle. They are on the verge of winning that battle, so they have refused to divert or get distracted by the Syrian digression. They have absolutely refused to get distracted. Initially, they did use their air force to try and help Bashar al-Assad's forces, the Syrian Army, as they had done in 2015, 2016, and by 18 they had destroyed the ISIS. By 2019, Abbasi, the head of the ISIS, Baghdadi, had been killed. And by 2019, it was all over, bar the shouting as far as the civil war was concerned. Most of the insurgents were driven to Idlib, where they formed a huge base to wait their time and tide to wait for a favorable moment to start the war all over again, Russia made the mistake of accepting that insurgent base in Idlib. It should not have. A ceasefire in situ can cause serious problems. And I'm sure the Russians will keep this lesson in mind when they look for a ceasefire or when Donald Trump tries to impose a ceasefire in Ukraine. They will have to keep this in mind. They accepted a huge military conglomeration in Idlib. 1 lakh insurgents were allowed to hang around in Idlib, right? Beaten, but they bided their time, and in 4 years Turkey rebuilt them. They brought in the Turkomans, they brought in the Uyghurs from Xinjiang to fight, get trained. They brought in Ukrainian instructors to train them in the use of drones and all that, and with the help of that they rebuilt this and they launched it in 2024. The Americans had paid for this, the Israelis had paid for this because the Israelis found that Syria was being used as a supply route by the Iranians to send their latest missiles, rockets and equipments to replenish the Hezbollah. They knocked out the Hezbollah first, and now they have finished the supply routes. In fact, they have finished the state of Syria. They have finished the state of Syria, once proud nation state, which had a very professional standing army, all gone to pieces. All gone to pieces in a very tragic turn of events. By the way, the Russians had realized that the Syrian army had become rotten and hollow to the core. They had told Bashar al-Assad, you will have to reform this army. You will have to restructure and recreate this army. But Bashar al-Assad took the easy route because those people he felt had stood by him, and it has been a tragic undoing of Assad and his state of Syria. The Russians decided that if the Syrian army is not prepared to fight for Syria, well, the Air Force, even the Air Force of the Russians can do very little. Even Iranian Revolutionary Guards can do very little. If the main Syrian army just refuses to fight, just buckles up and melts away, throws its weapons and melts away, puts on civilian jeans and decides to flee, commit treachery against its own nation state, well, that is what you get. Today there are a whole lot of treacherous outfits out there, out to kill the people, out to terrify the people, stone the women to death, keep them out of schools. Great achievement. Absolutely stellar achievement, stellar model for the rest of the third world to follow. The ISIS is back in favor with the United States. I think it is a tragic denouement. It is tragic hypocrisy. There are two types of terrorists, good terrorists and bad terrorists, and you can flip like a seesaw. You can flip like a weathercock, and the good terrorist today becomes the bad terrorist tomorrow, who is hunted, killed, $10 million bounty, and today the man with a $10 million bounty is one model for the third world, model liberator, if you please. Thank you.